Marcus considered the written word his truest companion, the silent, immutable testament to human experience. His apartment, a labyrinth of stacked volumes and meticulously organized archives, offered a sanctuary from the unpredictable clamor of external life. He preferred the cool, dry air of a library, the rustle of turning pages, to any social interaction. History, for Marcus, was a science of dissection and reconstruction, a precise arrangement of facts. Speculation was an indulgence, superstition anathema. The letter arrived without fanfare, a thick, cream-colored envelope bearing an unfamiliar crest. It sat on his desk for 2 days, an anachronism among his research notes on the socio-economic impact of 17th-century agricultural reforms. Eventually, a call from a persistent solicitor in a distant county forced his hand. An inheritance. Blackwood Manor. Marcus listened, his expression neutral, as the solicitor's clipped voice detailed the estate. A distant, forgotten relative, a man whose lineage Marcus had never bothered to trace, had passed. Blackwood Manor, the solicitor explained with a faint, almost imperceptible hesitation, carried a certain local reputation. Whispers of a dark past, of misfortunes befalling its occupants. Marcus merely hummed, a non-committal sound, his mind already cataloging the information. Local folklore, he concluded. The predictable embellishment of rural isolation. He had no interest in ghost stories, only verifiable records. Still, an inherited property, potentially valuable, demanded his attention. The prospect of an extensive, uncatalogued private library, however, was the only true lure. The journey stretched for hours, dissolving the familiar landscape into a succession of increasingly desolate vistas. The asphalt narrowed, then gave way to a gravel track that wound through skeletal trees. The driver, a taciturn man hired by the solicitor, navigated the ruts with practiced ease, his silence a welcome counterpoint to Marcus's own thoughts. The sky, which had been a pale, unassuming gray, deepened into a bruised purple. It was not merely old, it was ancient, a hulking mass of blackened stone and gabled roofs that seemed to absorb the waning light rather than reflect it. A rusted wrought iron gate, its hinges groaning like an expiring beast, stood ajar. The drive, choked with weeds, ascended towards the main entrance where a colossal oak door, studded with iron, waited like a sealed mouth. Marcus stepped out of the vehicle. The silence was profound, broken only by the whisper of the wind through the gnarled branches overhead and the crunch of his shoes on the gravel. He looked up at the manor. The solicitor had mentioned its size, but not its overwhelming presence. It felt less like a structure and more like a geological formation, an outcrop of malevolence. As he walked towards the entrance, he noticed a smaller, detached building to the east, partially obscured by overgrown rhododendrons. Its facade was peeling, a faded mural of a grinning jester barely visible above a boarded-up entrance. It was undeniably an old cinema, its marquee long gone, but the distinctive shape of the projection booth still discernible on the roofline. An odd addition to a manor of this age, he thought, a jarring note in the historical symphony. He made a mental note to investigate it later, a curiosity to be catalogued. The heavy oak door, when he finally pushed it, opened with a protracted groan that resonated through the very foundations of the house. He walked into the grand hall. Cobwebs draped from the soaring ceiling like tattered shrouds. A massive, unlit fireplace dominated one wall, its hearth filled with a fine layer of ash. His footsteps echoed, amplified, swallowed by the vastness of the space. He ran a gloved hand over a massive, dust-laden console table. Marcus, the historian, felt a familiar thrill, not of fear, but of discovery. This was a place saturated with the past, a treasure trove of potential research. The local legends were just that, legends. He would find the facts, the ledgers, the letters, the truth buried beneath the romanticized decay. He would peel back the layers of superstition, exposed the mundane realities of wealth and decline. His rational mind began to formulate a plan of systematic exploration, a methodical approach to cataloging the manor's contents. It wasn't fear, not precisely. It was a peculiar weight, an almost physical pressure in the air, as if the very walls were exhaling. He dismissed it as the effect of isolation, of the sheer scale and age of the place. He was merely tired from the journey. He told himself this with a conviction that felt, even to him, a fraction too deliberate. The manor's silence was absolute, a heavy velvet cloak that absorbed the distant rustle of leaves and the sigh of the wind. Marcus found it conducive to his work, a stark contrast to the low hum of traffic and the muffled conversations that had once permeated his old apartment. Here, the only sounds were those he made: the rustle of paper, the soft thud of a book placed on a table, the creak of floorboards underfoot. He spent the first week in a state of methodical industry, transforming the manor's cavernous study into a semblance of his former sanctuary. He arranged his collection of historical texts with an almost ritualistic precision. Leather-bound volumes, meticulously indexed and cross-referenced, emerged from their crates. The scent of aged paper and dry glue filled the air, a comforting aroma that grounded him. He had chosen the study for its vast, empty shelves and a grand oak desk that, despite its imposing size, felt sturdy and reliable. Sunlight, when it managed to pierce the heavy, leaded glass windows, illuminated dust motes dancing in the air, ancient particles suspended in time. One afternoon, as he organized a particularly dense collection of 18th century parish records, a sudden chill permeated the air. It was localized, a pocket of frigid dampness that pricked his skin, despite the mild autumn temperature outside. Marcus paused, his fingers hovering over a brittle page. He scanned the room, noting the heavy draperies were drawn, the windows sealed. An old house, he reasoned, would have drafts, imperfect insulation, perhaps a poorly sealed chimney flue in a forgotten corner. He shrugged, pulling his cardigan tighter, and returned to his work, filing the incident under architectural quirks. Days bled into a routine of research and cataloging. He traced the manor's lineage, the names of its past owners, through property deeds and archived correspondence. Each document was a thread, weaving a tapestry of local history. He found a strange satisfaction in piecing together these forgotten lives, a detached, academic pleasure. Then came the whispers. They were faint, indistinct, like the echo of voices through several closed doors, always just beyond the cusp of intelligibility. He heard them first while poring over a collection of Victorian-era letters, detailing agricultural disputes. Marcus lifted his head, straining his ears. Nothing. The house was silent again, save for the ticking of his own antique pocket watch. He attributed it to the wind, perhaps rattling a loose pane of glass, or the old house settling. His mind, accustomed to quiet, was simply over-interpreting ambient noise. The misplaced objects were harder to dismiss, yet he did so with the same unwavering logic. A particular volume, The Forgotten Customs of the Northern Moors, which he distinctly remembered placing on the second shelf, was found later on the floor beneath the desk. His fountain pen, a specific Waterman he used for annotations, vanished from his desk blotter only to reappear hours later, nestled amongst a pile of unrelated maps. He chastised himself. His mind, he concluded, was simply more preoccupied than he realized. The sheer volume of his collection, the newness of the space, must be leading to these minor lapses in memory and attention. He was, after all, a creature of habit, and this new environment was a radical departure. One evening, while clearing an unused cabinet beneath a dusty alcove, Marcus's hand brushed against something unexpected. Not the smooth wood he anticipated, but a rough, leather-bound object tucked away in the back. He pulled it out. It was a journal, its cover faded and scarred, held shut by a tarnished brass clasp. Its pages, brittle and yellowed, were filled with a spidery, looping script. It wasn't part of his collection. It was clearly a personal artifact. The handwriting belonged to a Lady Eleanor, an owner from the late 19th century, whose name he recognized from the property deeds. He began to read. His historian's curiosity piqued. The early entries were mundane, detailing social calls, garden plans, and the daily minutiae of estate management. But as he turned the pages, a subtle shift in tone became apparent. August 14th, 1888. I find myself drawing the curtains even in the brightest hours. The servants complain of drafts, but I sense something more profound. Poetic flourish, perhaps, or a symptom of melancholia. He continued. September 3rd, 1888. My memories. They seem to slip like water through a sieve. I searched for my embroidery for an hour, only to find it in my hand. One feels as though a part of oneself is being quietly, methodically removed. He paused. This sounded less like melancholia and more like something else. Senility? But Lady Eleanor, according to his records, had been in her late 30s at the time of these entries. October 12th, 1888. I hear voices. They are not distinct, merely a murmur, a constant hum at the edge of hearing. He rationalized it quickly. An old house, isolation, perhaps a predisposition to anxiety. It was not uncommon for individuals in such environments to develop peculiar habits or perceptions. He had read countless historical accounts of hermits and recluses exhibiting similar patterns. He turned to the next page. The script grew erratic, slanting downwards, the ink occasionally smudged as if the writer's hand had trembled. November 1st, 1888. It watches. I feel its eyes upon me, though I see no form. It consumes. My thoughts, my recollections, they are no longer entirely my own. The house. It breathes. It desires. The entry abruptly ended, a jagged tear across the page, as if it had been ripped from the binding in haste. Marcus closed the journal, the brass clasp clicking shut with a finality that echoed in the silent room. He sat there, the journal heavy in his hands, his mind racing to construct a logical explanation. Lady Eleanor, he concluded, must have suffered a severe psychological breakdown. The isolation of the manor, the lack of stimulation, perhaps a genetic predisposition to mental illness. These were all plausible historical interpretations. He placed the journal carefully on his desk, separate from his own meticulous research. It was a fascinating primary source, an insight into the psychological decline of a past inhabitant. Nothing more. Not for the wind or the settling of old timbers. It was no longer merely quiet. It felt attentive. The brass clasp of the journal clicked, a sharp punctuation mark in the profound silence of the study. Marcus sat, the leather-bound volume heavy in his grip, the final torn page a raw wound in his composure. His mind, usually a fortress of logic and empirical data, grappled with the implications of the abrupt, unsettling entry. A logical explanation, he mused, was simply eluding him for the moment. The paper was old, brittle. Perhaps an accident, a clumsy hand, a frayed binding. He set the journal aside, pushing the unsettling narrative from his immediate focus. There were other documents to sift through, more practical matters requiring his attention. The day progressed, a slow crawl of mundane tasks. He organized his research notes, cataloged a small collection of antique maps found in a dusty trunk, and meticulously cleaned a layer of grime from a set of ornate bookshelves. Yet, an undercurrent of unease persisted. It was subtle at first, a peripheral awareness. A faint whisper, like dry leaves skittering across distant flagstones, seemed to brush past his ear. He paused, head cocked, listening. Nothing. Only the sigh of the wind through the eaves and the rhythmic tick of the grandfather clock in the hall. Later, as twilight bled through the tall windows, painting the study in shades of bruised violet and gray, The fleeting disturbances intensified. He snapped his head around, his gaze sweeping the book-lined walls, the heavy drapes, the empty doorway. Just the familiar, encroaching gloom. His eyes, he reasoned, were tired. The dim light, the strain of deciphering faded script. It was a simple trick of perception. He rubbed his temples, a dull ache throbbing behind his eyes. Sleep offered no respite. The first night, his dreams were a fractured kaleidoscope of images. The manor's labyrinthine corridors stretching into an impossible distance, the scent of damp earth and decaying paper, and a persistent low murmur that vibrated through the very foundations of his dream self. He woke abruptly, gasping, sweat plastering his hair to his forehead. He lay there, rigid, until the first hint of dawn diffused through the window, painting the room in a less hostile light. The nightmares became a nightly ritual, each one more vivid, more unsettling than the last. He dreamt of a grand ballroom, filled with faceless figures dancing to unheard music, their movements jerky and unnatural. He saw a child's toy, a rocking horse, swaying gently in an empty nursery, its painted eyes fixed on an unseen horror. Driven by a renewed sense of urgency, Marcus plunged deeper into the manor's archives. He meticulously cross-referenced property deeds, family correspondence, and brittle newspaper clippings. His initial goal had been to construct a definitive historical timeline. Now, an unspoken, more primal curiosity guided his hands. He was searching for a pattern. A previous owner, a reclusive painter from the late 1800s, had, according to a local gazette, succumbed to a melancholic madness after years of isolation in the manor, eventually disappearing without a trace. Another entry from the early 1930s detailed the suicide of a young academic found in the manor's library. His final journal entries filled with increasingly paranoid ramblings about voices in the stone and memories that weren't his own. Marcus uncovered a series of letters from a distressed relative concerning a woman who had inherited the manor in the 1950s. When the relative visited, the manor was empty, the woman gone, leaving only her half-finished needlepoint and a faint, cloying scent of decay. He even found a faded article from a local paper dating back to the 1960s, detailing a peculiar incident. A visiting film critic staying at the manor while researching a book had been found wandering the nearby woods, disoriented and speaking incoherently about the flickering images and a show that never ended at the old cinema. The article mentioned he'd been obsessed with the derelict building, spending days there before his mental break. The cinema itself had been closed for decades, a local landmark slowly crumbling. What did an abandoned cinema have to do with the manor's history of mental collapse? The common thread was undeniable. A thick, suffocating rope woven through generations. Prolonged isolation within the manor's walls invariably led to madness, disappearance, or self-destruction. Marcus traced the dates, the names, the fates. Each story, unique in its specifics, echoed the same horrific trajectory. His determination, once a shield against superstition, began to crack. It was not the wind, nor the creak of old timber. It was a voice, indistinct, but undeniably there, emanating from the very fabric of the room. Marcus froze, every muscle tensed. He could not make out words, only a sibilant, hungry sound. The air grew heavy, thick with an unseen presence. It was an entity, and it was beginning to stir. The brittle letters, with their frantic script and increasingly desperate tone, lay splayed across the dusty mahogany desk. Marcus traced a finger over a particularly blurred word. Sorrow. The final, unfinished word from the previous correspondent's last missive. He had initially dismissed the woman's descent into paranoia, as documented by her concerned relative, as a tragic case of isolation and mental decline. Now, a sliver of unease had begun to worm its way into his carefully constructed skepticism. The notion of the house remembering and the walls whispering resonated with a nascent, unsettling familiarity. He pushed back from the desk, the chair scraping on the bare floorboards. The silence of the manor pressed in, thick and unwavering. It was not merely the absence of sound, but a palpable density, as if the very air held its breath. Yet the smell seemed to intensify when he was alone, when the house felt most attentive. He felt a prickle on the back of his neck, the distinct sensation of being observed. It was not a physical presence, no shifting curtain or creaking floorboard, but a pervasive, internal awareness. The house, he thought, was watching him, judging him. That night, the visions began. Marcus had retired to the master bedroom, the heavy velvet curtains drawn against the encroaching gloom. He lay in the antique four-poster, listening to the rhythmic creak of the old timber. Sleep, however, refused to come. A faint, sweet scent, like wilting lilies, blossomed around him. Then, the walls of the room began to shimmer. It was subtle at first, a ripple in his peripheral vision, like heat haze distorting distant objects. Then, the wallpaper, with its faded floral pattern, seemed to thin, becoming translucent. Through it, he saw glimpses. A woman, her face contorted in silent anguish, standing by the window. She wrung her hands, her shoulders shaking with an unseen burden. He squeezed his eyes shut, then opened them. The vision flickered, dissolved. The wallpaper was solid again, the scent of lilies gone. He sat up, heart thrumming against his ribs. A trick of the mind, exhausted and stimulated by the letters. But the next day, the manifestations grew bolder. He was in the vast, unused drawing room, examining a cracked portrait. The air around him suddenly crackled with a distinct, acrid smell of ozone and burning wood. The walls around him seemed to recede, the ceiling rising to an impossible height. He was no longer in the drawing room. He stood in a cavernous space, dimly lit by a single flickering projector beam. Rows of empty plush seats stretched before him, their velvet worn smooth. The air was stale, thick with the forgotten breath of countless patrons. This was an old cinema. The scent of stale popcorn and dust was overwhelming. They were vague, indistinct shapes, but he could sense their movement, their excitement, their fear. He heard a faint, distant murmur of voices, a collective gasp, a ripple of laughter that died abruptly. Her agony was palpable, vibrating through the very floor beneath his feet. Grief. He tried to move, to call out, but his limbs felt heavy, anchored to the spot. He was a spectator, trapped in a memory not his own. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the vision receded. The projector beam vanished. The smell of the old cinema dissipated, replaced by the persistent metallic tang of the manor. He was back in the drawing room, the cracked portrait staring blankly from the wall. His breath hitched in his throat, his hands trembling. He had not merely imagined it. He had been there. The experience left him profoundly shaken. The rational explanations, the psychological dismissals, felt inadequate, flimsy. The house was not merely old, it was alive. It was not merely haunted, it was a repository, a projector of past suffering. And he was not just living in it. He was becoming part of its audience, its unwilling participant. Throughout the rest of the day, the unseen presence intensified. He felt judged, scrutinized, as if every thought, every movement was being recorded, absorbed. The house seemed to hum with a low, almost imperceptible vibration, a deep resonance that settled in his bones. He found himself walking with a cautious slowness, speaking in hushed tones, afraid to disturb the silent, watchful entity that surrounded him. His carefully constructed skepticism, a lifelong bulwark against the irrational, began to crack, splintering under the weight of these impossible experiences. Now, the word resonated, a dull echo in the cavernous silence of the manor. Days bled into one another. Marcus found himself increasingly disinclined to leave the study, then the library, then the manor itself. He told himself it was the sheer volume of his research, the urgency of deciphering the cryptic entries in the estate ledgers, and the increasingly disturbing personal journals he unearthed. Yet, a deeper, less rational inertia held him. The thought of stepping beyond the massive oak front doors felt like a betrayal, a severance from a burgeoning, intimate understanding he was developing with the house. One afternoon, a specific entry in a late 19th century diary mentioned a moving picture show at the old cinema in the village. Marcus, driven by a flicker of his former academic rigor, decided a trip to the nearby, largely deserted village might offer a tangible connection to the past, a brief respite from the manor's ever-present atmosphere. He walked towards the front door, his hand reaching for the heavy iron handle. A cold draft, sharper than any he'd felt before, snaked around his ankles, then up his spine. The floorboards above creaked, a slow, deliberate groan. He paused, his fingers hovering. He lowered his hand. The urge to leave evaporated, replaced by a sudden, overwhelming weariness. The village, with its crumbling structures and overgrown paths, seemed utterly uninviting. His mobile phone, which had previously held a tenuous signal near the drawing room window, now displayed a persistent no-service message. He found the ancient landline in the pantry, its rotary dial a relic. He attempted to call the solicitor, the man who had facilitated the inheritance. The line remained stubbornly dead, a flat, unresponsive hum. He tried a colleague, a fellow historian who might appreciate the scope of his discoveries, but the receiver remained silent. A peculiar calm settled over him. It was as if the manor had drawn a heavy velvet curtain between him and the rest of existence. The absence of connection didn't alarm him as it should have. Instead, it reinforced the manor's singular importance. His own well-being began to recede as a priority. He often neglected to shave, the stubble on his jaw growing coarse and uneven. His clothes, once neatly pressed, hung loose and rumpled. Sleep became a fractured affair, filled with vivid, confusing dreams that blended his own memories with fragmented glimpses of the manor's past inhabitants. He would wake, disoriented, unsure if the faint scent of pipe tobacco in his room was a lingering phantom or a genuine presence. One evening, while sifting through a stack of mildewed playbills in a forgotten chest in the servants' quarters, Marcus's fingers brushed against something stiff and textured. He pulled it out. It was a perfectly preserved ticket stub, faded but legible, for a showing at the old cinema. The date, meticulously printed, was exactly 87 years ago to the day. The paper felt cool against his thumb, almost alive. A shiver traced its way down his arms. He had not been to the village, had not encountered anyone, yet here was a tangible piece of its past, sitting in a chest within the manor's walls. The house was not merely a structure. It was a vast, breathing entity. He could feel its presence in the subtle shifts of air temperature, the way the light fell through the grimy windows, the persistent creaks and groans that were no longer just settling timbers but sounded like a language, a low, guttural murmur. It demanded his attention, his focus, and in return, it offered a profound, if terrifying, sense of belonging. The world outside, the world of schedules and external expectations, seemed to shrink, becoming less real, less important. Only the manor, with its secrets and its suffocating embrace, truly mattered. Now, a faint chill, not from the drafty room, seemed to settle deep within his own chest, an echo of that very emotion. He felt it, a profound, unbidden sadness, as if it had been waiting for him, a cloak woven from the house's ancient dust. He pushed away from the desk, the scrape of the chair legs against the polished floor unnervingly loud in the profound silence. The afternoon light, usually a pale wash through the tall windows, seemed to recede, leaving the corners of the study in a perpetual twilight. He needed air, clarity. Yet, an invisible weight pressed against him, a reluctance to cross the threshold, as if the very act would sever a vital connection. He walked into the corridor, intending to reach the main hall, then the front door. He had traversed it countless times. But today, the arrangement of the portraits seemed subtly wrong. A stern-faced merchant, previously positioned near the antechamber, now stared down from a spot closer to the main staircase. Marcus paused, a frown creasing his brow. He was certain. He had catalogued every painting, every bust, every piece of furniture in his initial methodical survey. He knew this house. Or did he? He continued, his pace slowing. He reached the end of the corridor, expecting the wide expanse of the main hall. The house was changing. He pushed aside a heavy curtain, the fabric releasing a puff of dust that caught the scant light filtering from somewhere above. He stepped into a vast, decaying chamber. A screen, yellowed and torn, hung before a proscenium arch. The air here was stagnant, heavy with the scent of mildewed velvet and forgotten popcorn. He had never encountered such a room in the manor before. It was an impossibility. Yet, here it was, undeniably present, a physical manifestation of architectural defiance. How had he missed this? Had it always been here, hidden? Or had it simply appeared? He ran a hand over a dusty seat. The fabric was rough, matted. He stumbled, catching himself on the back of a seat. The memory was not his. He was Marcus, the historian. He was a man of facts, of empirical evidence. But the conviction wavered, a fragile thing in the face of this impossible room. He tried to retrace his steps, to find the corridor he had just left. He turned, but the velvet-lined passage was gone. He ran his hands over the smooth surface of the wall, searching for a seam, a handle, anything. Nothing. He was trapped. He closed his eyes, pressing his palms against his temples. This is not real. This is a trick of the mind. He opened his eyes. He could no longer distinguish the details of the stage or the torn screen. The rows of seats became indistinct shapes, like hunched figures waiting, watching. To remember what? A name? A face? A purpose? He recoiled, shaking his head violently. No, I am Marcus. The words were weak, barely a whisper in the vast, consuming dark. He stumbled forward, driven by an irrational need to escape, to find his house again, the house he knew. He pressed against the wall where the passage had been, then moved along the perimeter of the vast room, his hands scraping against the rough wood. Every turn, every corner, seemed to lead him deeper into the labyrinth, not out of it. The old cinema stretched on, an endless, silent testament to a forgotten past, or perhaps a present he could no longer comprehend. He saw himself, Marcus, the historian, meticulously poring over ancient texts. But then, superimposed, he saw another man, a collector, obsessively polishing a tarnished silver locket, weeping over its contents. And another, an architect, sketching intricate designs for a new wing, his brow furrowed with a familiar sorrow, the faces blurred, the feelings intertwined. His breath came in ragged gasps. He was Marcus, yes, but he was also Elias, and the collector, and the architect, and all the others whose echoes the house had absorbed. The house was not merely changing its layout, it was changing him. It was becoming his mind, and his mind, in turn, was becoming the house. The sorrow he had traced on the letter was now his own, a deep, pervasive ache for a self that was rapidly slipping away. Now a different, more chilling interpretation began to coalesce. The previous occupant, a distant relative named Alistair, had written of fading colors, lost faces, and a hollow space where joy once resided. Not the language of simple madness Marcus now perceived, but of absence, of something actively taken. Alistair's later entries were mere fragments, repetitive phrases about the hunger and the taste of memory, before trailing off into indecipherable loops. Marcus felt a peculiar emptiness in his own head, a momentary blankness that swallowed the context of the letter he had just read. He blinked, the words on the page momentarily meaningless, a jumble of black ink on cream paper. He pushed the letters aside, his gaze drifting to the window. He had spent weeks here, meticulously cataloging documents, sifting through generations of forgotten lives. And in that time, his own memory had become porous. A child's laughter in a sun-drenched field, a woman's hand tracing a pattern on a window pane, the sharp scent of pipe tobacco. None of these belonged to him, yet they surfaced with an unsettling familiarity. He picked up Alistair's final, almost illegible entry. One word, scrawled larger than the rest, stood out. Cinema. Marcus remembered seeing an old, disused structure on the edge of the property, partially hidden by overgrown trees, a relic from a different era, long forgotten. He had assumed it was a barn or an old carriage house. A subtle compulsion, almost imperceptible, began to guide him. It wasn't a voice, nor a tangible pull, but a quiet, insistent suggestion that seemed to originate from within his own thoughts, yet felt profoundly external. The notion of investigating the old cinema, previously dismissed as irrelevant, now presented itself as an urgent necessity. The path to the old cinema was choked with thorny bushes and skeletal branches. The structure itself was a husk of rusted metal and splintered wood, its once vibrant paint faded to a sickly gray. A single warped poster, its image entirely bleached, hung askew by one corner. The air here was still and heavy, carrying the faint metallic scent of decay and something else, something cloying and sweet, like stale perfume and dust. He pushed open a sagging door. It groaned, a sound like a dying creature, and then swung inward with surprising ease. Dust motes danced in the sparse beams that pierced the grime-coated windows, illuminating a scene of profound desolation. Rows of tattered velvet seats, their springs exposed like jagged teeth, stretched into the gloom. Marcus walked down the aisle, his footsteps muffled by a thick carpet of dust and fallen debris. He reached the stage, a raised platform where a screen, now ripped and hanging in shreds, once commanded attention. He stood there, enveloped by the palpable stillness, and then it began. A faint hum vibrated through the floorboards, a low thrum that resonated in his chest. A memory, sharp and unbidden, flooded his mind. Himself, a younger man laughing, a woman's hand clasped in his, the smell of popcorn, the flicker of light on a silver screen. It was his memory, yet it felt as though it were being projected, analyzed, consumed. He saw the woman's face, vibrant and clear, then watched as it subtly blurred, her features softening, becoming generic, then fading, like an old photograph left in the sun. The feeling of her hand in his evaporated, leaving a phantom ache. This was not a recollection. It was an extraction. The manor wasn't merely haunted by residual energies. It was an active predator. It didn't just contain memories. It harvested them. The faded faces, the lost joys, the empty spaces Alistair had described, these were the remnants of what had been taken. The manor fed, not on blood or flesh, but on the very essence of its inhabitants, their recollections, their sanity, the vibrant energy of their lives. Each stolen memory, each fragment of a personality, strengthened it, gave it more substance. The hum intensified, a low, guttural growl that seemed to emanate from the very stone of the building. The fleeting memories, the cognitive fog, the sudden disorientation, these were not symptoms of stress or isolation. They were the subtle incursions of a colossal, insatiable hunger. He was not merely living in a haunted house. He was the current, preferred meal. He was trapped, not by walls, but by an entity that was slowly, meticulously consuming him from the inside out, piece by agonizing piece. But now, A cold, hard clarity cut through the haze that had been thickening in his own thoughts. He recognized the terror in the looping, uneven strokes, a terror that mirrored the icy grip tightening around his own awareness. This was not merely the ramblings of a madman. This was a warning. It was a predator. It fed, and he was its current meal. The memories it had stolen, the subtle shifts in his perception, the way the past bled into the present. These were not random occurrences. They were deliberate acts of consumption. The thought ignited a spark of pure, unadulterated defiance within him. He would not be another forgotten name scrawled on a crumbling page. He needed to find something. Anything. A way to fight back. A means to sever the parasitic connection, to escape its suffocating embrace. His gaze swept around the study, no longer seeing a historical archive, but a cage. He began his search methodically, though a frantic energy pulsed beneath his skin. He started with the house's oldest records, pulling down weighty, leather-bound tomes that reeked of dust and decay. He flipped through ledgers, journals, and architectural plans, his fingers brushing against brittle paper, searching for any anomaly, any mention of a weakness, a ritual, a countermeasure. The house, sensing his resistance, seemed to push back. His search led him through forgotten passages, behind tapestries that crumbled at his touch, and down narrow, winding staircases that seemed to spiral deeper than the manor's foundations should allow. Each step was a battle against the house's influence, against the growing conviction that his efforts were futile. He felt its tendrils probing at his resolve, trying to re-establish the blurring, the apathy. He clenched his jaw, forcing himself to focus on the tangible, the immediate. This was it, the old cinema. Rows of dust-shrouded seats, their plush fabric torn and stained, stretched out before him, facing a vast mildewed screen. Marcus stepped onto the stage, the boards creaking under his weight. He ran his hand along the velvet curtain, now stiff with age and grime. This place felt different. Not just old, but used in a way the rest of the manor hadn't been. Used for projection, for shared experiences, for the temporary suspension of disbelief. Tapping it, he confirmed it. There was a space. With renewed determination, he found a loose panel, hidden behind a tear in the canvas. Inside, nestled amongst cobwebs and fine grit, lay a single peculiar object. It had no discernible lock or latch, yet it felt sealed. Its surface was covered in a series of symbols, not words, but abstract shapes that seemed to twist and writhe, some resembling ancient constellations, others like microscopic organisms. As Marcus grasped the box, a flash of insight, sharp and painful, pierced through the house's mental fog. He saw fragments, a cloaked figure, not unlike the ones in the manor's oldest paintings, holding a similar box. A ritual performed not to bind a spirit, but to contain something vast and formless, to anchor it, to give it limits. The house didn't just feed on memories. It fed on the resonance of shared human experience, the collective emotional energy that had once filled this space. This box, he understood, was not for destroying the house, but for starving it, for turning its own consumption against it. A low growl, deep and resonant, vibrated through the floorboards of the old cinema, shaking the very stage beneath him. The house knew. It was aware of his discovery, of his intent. He had found his weapon, his desperate chance. But the house was awake now, truly awake, and its resistance was absolute. Now the word resonated with a chilling clarity. He felt that sorrow himself, a creeping, insidious desolation that settled deep in his bones. Not his own, but an echo of countless others. The air in the study thickened, pressing against his eardrums, a silent, pervasive hum. A sudden, sharp crack, like a rifle shot, ripped through the quiet. Marcus flinched, his head snapping up. The sound had come from the hallway. He listened, his breath held. Nothing. Only the low, persistent thrumming that seemed to emanate from the very floorboards beneath his feet. He pushed away from the desk, the scrape of the chair a harsh interruption. His gaze swept the room, seeking a source, any source, for the jarring noise. The heavy oak door to the study, which he had left ajar, was now firmly shut, its latch secured with a decisive click. He hadn't heard it close. He hadn't felt a draft. A prickle crawled up his spine, a sensation distinct from fear, more akin to being watched by something immense and ancient. He tried the handle. It turned, but the door remained stubbornly sealed, as if its frame had swollen to an impossible degree. He pushed, then pulled, with increasing force, but the door refused to yield. This was not old wood warping. This was deliberate. He felt a shift, a subtle reordering of the manor around him. The familiar layout, once a comforting maze of history, now felt like a trap. He tried another door, one leading to a smaller antechamber, hoping to find an alternate route. The door slammed shut with a concussive thud that rattled the glass in the nearby cabinet. The house was not merely reacting to him. It was fighting him. Its malevolence had sharpened, its presence coalescing into physical obstacles. He knew with a certainty that bypassed logic that the manor intended to keep him exactly where he was, or perhaps to guide him somewhere else entirely. He moved through the manor, no longer exploring, but navigating a hostile landscape. Corridors he remembered taking yesterday now ended abruptly in solid walls, their plaster and wallpaper seamlessly reformed. Staircases stretched impossibly, the steps growing longer, the risers higher as he ascended, an Asherian nightmare of shifting architecture. They were translucent, like faint impressions left on the air, yet their presence was palpable, urging him in directions he did not wish to go. This was the old cinema. Rows of velvet-covered seats, moth-eaten and draped in cobwebs, faced a colossal stained screen. A projector, a hulking iron beast, stood silent in a booth high above the seating area. Then, a flicker. Not light, not a beam from the projector, but a ripple across the screen itself, like water disturbed. The screen began to glow with an internal phosphorescent light, revealing images, not projected, but imprinted. They were not static. They moved. A woman, dressed in the fashion of a bygone era, sat slumped in one of the very seats Marcus now stood beside, his face pale, eyes wide and vacant. He recognized the frantic script. It was the author of the letters. The images accelerated, a terrifying montage of faces, all contorted in fear, despair, or blank, catatonic emptiness. Children, adults, old and young, their features blurring into a single collective mask of suffering. Marcus saw their memories, not as distinct events, but as a swirling vortex of color and sound, being pulled from them, absorbed by the very fabric of the screen, by the walls, by the floor, by the air itself. He understood then. This wasn't a haunted house. It was a predator. A vast, sentient entity that didn't just feed on fear, but on the essence of its inhabitants, their lived experiences, their very sanity. The old cinema was a consumption chamber, a place where the manor processed its meals, replaying the slow, torturous draining of its victims' minds. His own face suddenly appeared on the screen, superimposed over the screaming woman, his eyes wide with the same dawning horror. He saw his own thoughts, his own memories, shimmering like heat haze, already being drawn toward the glowing surface. The house was not merely showing him the past, it was showing him his future. It was showing him itself feeding. A spectral hand, translucent and bone-thin, reached from the screen towards his reflected image, its touch leaving trails of gray dust. The chairs around him began to creak and sway, their velvet seats rustling as if unseen occupants shifted in their places, watching the macabre show. He fought against it, his muscles straining, his mind screaming in defiant refusal. The word sorrow on the brittle letter had been more than a scrawl. It was a key. Marcus had spent the last hours sifting through the remaining correspondence, piecing together the fractured narrative of the previous inhabitants. The manor was a predator, and it had a heart, a focal point. He had a plan, tenuous but precise, born from the very terror that now gnawed at the edges of his own mind. He moved through the manor's deeper passages, the air growing heavy, tasting of dust and something metallic, like old blood or rust. The architecture seemed to shift subtly around him, familiar corridors elongating, doorways appearing where none had been before. The house was awake, aware of his intent, and it was not pleased. Each step echoed too loudly, then not at all, as if the sound itself was being absorbed. The floorboards beneath his boots felt spongy in places, then unnervingly solid like granite. His research, combined with the fragmented accounts, pointed to a section of the house he had only vaguely explored. A peculiar, isolated wing, almost an afterthought in the manor's sprawling design. Beyond lay a long, narrow hallway, carpeted in a thick, faded crimson that seemed to absorb all light. At the end of the hallway, a pair of double doors, grander than any he had yet encountered, stood ajar. He pushed them open fully, stepping across the threshold. He was in the old cinema. The space was cavernous, stretching before him like a gaping maw. Rows of velvet seats, many torn and spilling their stuffing, faced a vast, stained screen that dominated the far wall. Dust motes danced in the slivers of weak light that pierced the grimy, high-set windows. The air was thick with the scent of decay, mildew, and that persistent, sweet chemical tang. This was it, the nerve center, the heart. The projector whirred to life, a beam of sickly yellow light piercing the gloom, illuminating the dust-filled air. Then, the screen flickered. It wasn't a film in the traditional sense. Instead, images flashed across the vast canvas, fragments of lives, shards of memories. A child's laughter echoing in an empty nursery. Marcus saw a fleeting glimpse of himself, younger, laughing at a joke he no longer remembered. Then a distorted image of his father. The lines of worry etched deeper than he recalled. These weren't just images. They were sensations, emotions. The house was projecting the very essence of its victims, replaying their final moments, their deepest fears, their stolen identities. The house wasn't just consuming, it was assimilating. It was weaving these stolen lives into its own fabric, becoming a monstrous composite of all who had perished within its walls. This was the terrifying reveal. The house was not merely feeding on life force. It was building an identity, a consciousness, out of the fragments of others. His own memories, his own sense of self, were already being cataloged, processed, ready to be added to this horrific archive. If he failed, he wouldn't just be gone. He would become another flickering image on this screen, another note in the house's discordant symphony. He gripped the iron bar tighter, his knuckles white. The projector's hum intensified, a guttural growl now, and the images on the screen became more frantic, faster, a terrifying kaleidoscope of despair. He ignored the barrage, focusing on the projector. It was the heart of the display, the conduit. His plan was simple, brutal. Disable it. He would sever the feed. He would blind the house. He started forward, his boots crunching on unseen debris. As he moved, the images on the screen seemed to swell, focusing on his own life, his own vulnerabilities. A moment of childhood loneliness, a past academic failure, the gnawing doubt that had always haunted his solitary existence. The house was fighting back, striking at the very core of his being, attempting to shatter his will. Marcus pushed through the psychological assault, his eyes fixed on the projector. He wouldn't become a ghost in its machine. He wouldn't be another frame. He reached the base of the projector booth, the heavy iron bar raised, ready to strike. Each letter, increasingly desperate, hinted at a central point, a place where the house's hunger was most acute, a vortex of shared suffering. He understood now. The manor didn't merely consume memories. It devoured the emotional resonance of those memories, leaving behind hollowed-out shells of individuals. To survive, or to fight, he needed to starve it of that essence. A low, resonant hum vibrated through the floorboards of the study. It wasn't the creaking of old timber, but a deep, internal thrum, as if the house itself were drawing a breath. The light, already dim, began to pulse with an erratic blue-white glow, not from the window, but from an unseen source high above. The familiar lines of the bookshelves wavered, their spines blurring into rows of empty seats. The patterned carpet under his feet felt sticky, faintly grimy. Marcus wasn't in the study anymore. He stood in the cavernous expanse of an old cinema. The air was cold, despite the cloying sweetness, and utterly silent save for the subtle thrum. The projector's beam, a thick, milky column of light, emanated from a booth high at the rear, cutting through the dusty air like a surgical incision. This was the central point, the archive, the digestive tract of the house. On the screen, images began to flicker, not coherent scenes, but fragmented impressions. A woman weeping into a handkerchief, a child's outstretched hand grasping at nothing, a man staring blankly into a fire. These weren't just visual records. They carried a palpable weight, a deep, pervasive melancholy that seeped into the atmosphere. Marcus felt a subtle pull, a gentle suction at the edges of his consciousness, coaxing him to engage, to empathize, to offer his own wellspring of fear and despair. The house was feeding. He wouldn't offer it his sorrow. He had to deny it the emotional fuel. He couldn't empty himself. He had to flood it. Not with sorrow, but with something the house couldn't digest, something alien to its hunger. Logic, detachment, pure, unfeeling data. He closed his eyes for a moment, then opened them, focusing on the rhythmic, almost mechanical whirring sound that seemed to emanate from the projector booth. He recited the precise historical dates of the manor's construction, the names of its architects, the documented land transfers. He cataloged the architectural styles of its various wings, the chemical composition of the ink on the letters he had found. He didn't feel these facts. He merely stated them, a conduit of pure information. The images on the screen wavered. The sorrowful faces flickered, momentarily replaced by architectural blueprints, then historical maps, then back to the faces, but they seemed less defined, their edges fuzzier, like poorly rendered projections. The sucking sensation intensified, becoming almost desperate, as if the house were trying to reject the indigestible information he was forcing upon it. Marcus pressed on, his voice a relentless drone. He listed the geological strata of the surrounding land, the migratory patterns of local bird species, the precise astronomical positions on specific dates relevant to the manor's history. He became a vessel for facts, his own emotions receding, perhaps even burning away in the process. He felt himself thinning, not from being consumed, but from becoming pure data, an inert repository. The screen went black, then burst into a cacophony of distorted images and sounds. A scream that was also a burst of static, a beautiful landscape dissolving into a mosaic of meaningless pixels. The air vibrated, no longer with the cloying sweetness, but with the acrid tang of ozone and burning circuitry. The house was convulsing, rejecting the feast. He had starved it, yes, but he had also starved himself. It wasn't a sound of defeat. It was a sound of patient waiting. He could feel its presence, a vast, indifferent intelligence. He had denied it his memories, his emotions, his life. But in doing so, he had become a new kind of empty vessel, perfectly preserved, perfectly inert. The house had not absorbed him, not in the way it had others. It had simply contained him. a new exhibit in its vast, silent museum of the lost. He took a step, then another. The floorboards creaked. Was that his creak, or the house's memory of a step replayed for his benefit? He couldn't tell. The lines had blurred, irrevocably. He was Marcus, the historian. He remembered everything. He felt nothing. He was free, perhaps. Or perhaps this was a more profound absorption than any sorrowful memory could ever achieve.